I still hold that Putin has been greatly weakened by the situation with the Wagner Group. He's had to reorganize, and he's also had to retrench on public positions that he took for many, many years of having no involvement whatsoever with this plausibly deniable force. Now he has to own it, and now all of the lines of communication between the Kremlin and these networked paramilitaries are exposed to public scrutiny. And he, I think, ultimately recognizes that, and that's why we see kind of the mask being dropped.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're having an in-depth look at the Russian private military company Redut and whether it's right to view them as the new Wagner Group. Joining me to discuss that, I'm delighted to have Candace Rondeaux, Senior Director for the Future Frontline Programme at New America. She also directs the Planetary Politics Initiative, plus she's a Professor of Practice at Arizona State University and a faculty affiliate with ASU's Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian and East European Studies. Candace, thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James.
Let's just start off with who Redut are. Who are they?
Well, Redut is actually kind of old wine in new bottles. This is an organization that's been around since at least 2006, if you believe their website information. They started out as a group of former Spetsnaz, special forces guys, mostly from the airborne assault, some from GRU, and a handful from a few other smaller anti-terrorist organizations inside the law enforcement structure of Russia. They had a few different missions initially in Iraq, was one of their big missions. Later, they did some work in Syria, and they evolved. And in fact, I would say in some ways, the Wagner Group kind of came from Redut. And there are a lot of overlapping ties between the two organizations. A lot of people who have worked under the management of today's Redut and those who have worked under the management of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former head of the Wagner Group. They're a really important piece of the puzzle for Russia in terms of backfilling for delivery of weapons in places where Russia has cooperative agreements like Central African Republic, Libya, Syria, etc. And they've always been there. That's kind of the most important thing to understand, is that this is more continuity than change.
So is it fair to say they're the new Wagner Group? Are those comparisons accurate?
I don't think that that's right. I mean, it's more really like, what was the Wagner Group? Was it anything that looked like a company? And I think we all know the answer is no. It was a collection of shell companies that operated in different countries, but mostly was very tied to the GRU military intelligence wing. And Redut is no different. In fact, some of these forces were co-located exactly in the same buildings, coordinating their operations together, sometimes swapping, different specialists, particularly snipers, just as an example. So there's a comparison to be made, but again, just to point out that Wagner is sort of more brand, where Redut is more sort of substantial, cohesive center, and it actually has a registered corporate entity in Russian law.
And is there a figurehead, a leader of Redut in the way that Prigozhin was seen as the figurehead, the leader of Wagner?
Yeah, the longtime head of Redut is a guy named Konstantin Mirzayants. He is a former VDV airborne assault officer. He worked in military intelligence for the 45th Guards, Special Reconnaissance Brigade. For many, many years, he spent time in Chechnya. I believe there was some time in Transnistria as well. So this is a seasoned military expert, but he had trouble with the law. And that's one other common thread here is, along with Prigozhin, so many other people who are kind of in these leadership positions in the private military or paramilitary sector of Russia have run into trouble with the law. Either they've had problems with, challenges with their superiors, or they've done things where they've gotten in fights, with other civilians and gone to jail for murder. Mirzayansk was accused of murder in 1994, and he stood trial a number of different times. Ultimately, he was acquitted, although I think the victims and the victims' family continue to question the outcome of that case.
And is there a comparison that could be made between Mirzayansk and Prigozhin?
I mean, only in the sense that they both have this kind of criminal background. They have deep ties with certain parts of the mafia. Where Prigozhin's kind of power base came from the St. Petersburg mafia and its connections to the state. Mirzayansk is much more oriented toward Moscow, and that's a kind of different branch and different type of power center. And now I think we can see that I suppose the substantial difference that has occurred here is post Prigozhin's death. We see that Mirzayansk is more publicly standing alongside some of the other more official figures in the Ministry of Defense. So, for example, we've seen Mirzayansk travel with Yunusbek Yevkurov, who is the deputy minister who handles military technical arrangements for Russia. We've seen him alongside Andrei Avyanov, who is essentially head of the kill squad for the GRU, the operational squad of the GRU. So we know that this is substantially or qualitatively there is a difference where Prigozhin was kind of treated, I think, with kind of an arm's length kind of sense of the relationship with the Kremlin, especially in the early days. And he was given a very, very long leash. Mirzayansk is clearly on a tighter leash, and he has to be seen with official Ministry of Defense officials in order to perform his duties. And that's, I think, a real qualitative difference between the two.
And will that be Mirzayansk himself deciding, because of what happened to Prigozhin, look, I need to stay on side with the Kremlin? Or will it be the Kremlin, because of what happened with the mutiny over the summer, wanting to keep him close?
Well, so here's the other difference that I didn't quite touch on yet, which is that Prigozhin was not a military guy. Okay, it's really important to remember that he, unlike most of the people that worked for him, he spent most of his time in a jail cell while the Afghan war was going on. Mirzayansk was sort of in the mix, as we say, on the battlefront. He is a battle-hardened military veteran, and while some people describe him as certainly less charismatic than Prigozhin, he is certainly more, I think, militarily capable, and probably more disposed to towing the line than Prigozhin was as a result.
And so, given what you say, Candace, about Redut not being a new private military company, why do you think there is this renewed focus on them?
Well, obviously, this is the challenge with the story of Russia's paramilitary operations. As the story has evolved over the years, the English language press in particular has started to kind of wake up to the reality of what this really means for international security. And so, these discoveries are made about, new paramilitaries. I think the main reason is simply people want to know what happened after Prigozhin. I mean, that was a huge moment. His death was, I think, a thunderclap that kind of elicited a lot of concern about the stability inside the country of Russia and in the regime, and what it said about Putin's drive to control the ultranationalists who are kind of increasingly getting out of hand. So I suppose, in some ways, a focus on Redut shines a light on where Putin's mind is now with regard to controlling the ultranationalist elements within the country.
That's really interesting. I want to touch a bit more on how Putin will be viewing Redut in a moment, Candace. First, though, who fights for Redut? What kind of people do sign up for them?
Well, look, it's the same people. The vast majority, as far as we can tell, we've looked at, thousands and thousands of names associated with both Redut, Wagner Group, Rusich, which is another sort of offshoot branch. And the thing that they all tend to have in common is that they're special forces trained. Many of them are quite old. I will say that. And I would certainly say in the first 7, 8 years of the Wagner Group's operations, and then parallel to that, the Redut's operations during that time. So from, let's say, 2014 to 2020, 2021, a common thread was that they were in their 40s. A lot of them in their 40s, some of them in their early 50s, and so they were officers. Some of them were, warrant officers, so they're kind of like middle grade officers. Quite a few majors, captains, uh, et cetera, and a couple of colonels here and there. So one important thing to understand is that these guys understand themselves to be seasoned officer material, even though almost all of them have had challenges with kind of staying the course in the military and in their personal lives. One common thread, again, across all of this is a little bit of a struggle with alcohol and to some extent drugs. Interestingly, unlike other branches of Russia's armed forces, where there's a pervasive problem with drug use and alcohol use, this cadre of people and fighters tends to want to be abstemious. Doesn't always achieve that, but I would say, there is a qualitative difference between the conventional forces and paramilitaries in terms of their attitudes towards smoking and drinking in particular. And you can even see that in some of the conversations about the remainders of the Wagner Group, the kind of the senior commanders that remained on, like Andrei Troshev, who's been pictured, of course, sitting across from Putin in recent weeks. Here's a guy who has a terrible reputation when it comes to drinking. Was fell over so drunk one time after coming home from a tour in St. Petersburg that he had to be hospitalized. That kind of thing. And that's not super uncommon, but I will say that in this cohort, at least there's kind of an effort to try and keep physically fit, because this is the kind of work that they do is extremely complex. And it's not the kind of work for a guy who's sort of drinking and smoking and eating himself to death. There really is kind of a concern with that. And there's also, I would say, the other common kind of cultural factor is a deep-seated concern with kind of traditional values. A lot of hardcore ultra-Christian Orthodox folks, a lot of hardcore sort of neo-pagan believers within this group who kind of are trying to revive the old Rus of Viking times, basically, in their minds. That's kind of what's going on. So that's the cohort in a nutshell.
And am I right in saying, Candace, the terms of service, if you sign up for Redut, are different to if you signed up for the regular Russian army, that you might be on a time-limited contract?
Yes. Well, so here's the interesting thing. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish like what we're talking about when we're talking about contract service. Uh, you know, some people might know that actually for a long time, Russia has struggled to get the balance right between conscript services and then volunteer services, right? So conscripts tend to kind of outweigh, the preponderance of numbers in terms of conventional forces. I would say it's probably like three-quarters conscript at this stage. Russia has always had an ambition, though, to have an all-volunteer contract-based military, just like the United States or the UK or other NATO countries, etc. It has not been able to achieve that for a number of reasons. One is just the demographic gap. They don't have enough uh, physically fit, mentally fit fighting age males who are willing and able to sign up. But to quickly answer your question about sort of the contract terms for Redut fighters, it's more or less the same as for Wagner. It's about 6 months per. Sometimes it can be extended to 3 years, right? You can keep re-signing up and re-signing up. But 6 months is about the average, it seems, for each tour. And in some cases, others who are reaching at sort of the officer level, of course, may just kind of automatically be floaters, and who knows what their contract status is.
And where are Redut being deployed in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, as far as we know, they continue to be in eastern Donbass. We know that there was a time when they were just south of Bakhmut. However, since the implosion of Prigozhin's version of the Wagner group, there certainly has been some adjustment. And we know that we've heard talk of Wagner troops returning to Bakhmut. We think that must be Redut, right? I mean, that has to be because there is no more Wagner as far as we know. So we assume that there's kind of a conflation happening in terms of Redut forces returning to that Bakhmut area of eastern Ukraine.
And to what extent does Redut have operational independence?
Oh, I mean, none. I mean, and not no more than the Wagner Group did in some ways. I mean, I guess I would say the substantial difference is Redut has always had a firm relationship with the 45th Special Guards Reconnaissance Brigade. Their training center is co-located with that base in Kubinka. Mirzayansk is a veteran of the 45th. Other leaders are veterans of the 45th. And where the 45th goes, Redut often goes. This is true from back in the day in Georgia when they went to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And this is true in the early days of Syria as well as the first breach in Crimea in 2014. So there's a very close relationship, and it's very tightly managed.
So if you're Vladimir Putin, Candace, how do you view Redut?
I suppose I view Redut as a useful tool for ensuring that the military technical arrangements and partnerships that Russia has worked for so long remain stable. And that Russian goods and services, particularly in the military caste, continue to be sold abroad, and that the kind of an insurance policy for making sure that interdependency between Russia and its client base in Africa, in the Middle East, remains stable.
But I mean, some people might find it surprising that given his experience with the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, and he seemed to get his fingers burnt a bit there, why he still allows private military companies, mercenary groups, call them what you will, to operate.
Well, it's important what we call them. I want to be careful that, defining terms is extremely important in this work. These are not mercenaries. These are paramilitaries who fall within the chain of command of the Chief of General Staff, Valery Garsimov. So important to remember, and that was always true. That was true for Wagner. The difference was this: Prigozhin was indisciplined. The people that worked for him were indisciplined. He was an entrepreneur, and Mirzayansk is not the same kind of entrepreneur. He has a different mentality about his mission brief, and he is determined, and he has succeeded in surviving politically for decades now. I think the substantial difference here is just the kind of savviness of the players and their understanding of the military industrial complex and where they fit in with it is a key to understanding the future trajectory of Redut and its importance for Russia.
I mean, that's a very fair point you raise, but even so, is there not, does Putin not see some risk in allowing private military companies like Redut to operate?
But it's not the same. It's not a private military operation. That's end of story. I mean, if it, it's sort of like, does Putin still see some risk in using airborne forces? The answer is going to always be no, because you need them to prosecute a war, and these are integrated, embedded, fully managed forces. These are not private military contractors. These are people who are literally on contract with the Ministry of Defense, not as individuals, okay, but part of a complete and total package for special forces operations. That's really important to understand, is that Putin doesn't look differently at Redut primarily because it is almost a conventional military force.
So even though Redut would call itself a private military company, you would say just ignore that, just call it Redut. It's essentially part of the Russian forces.
First of all, I don't think Redut would call itself that. Okay, I think it would say It has serviced the Russian state, and I think you go on their website, you will see they have fulfilled missions. Now, sometimes, right, they'll call themselves a ČVK or a PMC, you know, talking loosely, but legal reality is, okay, this is a registered under law in Russia. It's registered as a military training center, okay, not a PMC, not some sort of special company. It is a military training center. And that's really important to understand. How is it possible? So that really is the substantial difference. This is not Blackwater. This is not the Wagner Group. This is an organization that is fully folded into the Ministry of Defense infrastructure and always has been from the beginning.
Is it true, Candace, that some of Redut soldiers are training in Chechnya? And if that is the case, what's the significance of that?
It is true that there are former contract soldiers who have signed up with Akhmat Battalion in Chechnya. I mean, this is a little bit probably a reflection of kind of where they come from. Of course, there are some who came from the Caucasus in the first place. They're returning home. They don't have the same kind of mission tempo that would call for them to deploy otherwise out of Molkino. Molkino is now, of course, the base where Wagner was once based. For all intents and purposes, that operation has closed, and now everything is either being run out of Kubinka or out of the North Caucasus. Again, so, this really shows you like who's in control here. Yunusbek Yevkurov is, of course, from the North Caucasus himself. He's had long relationships there. He was the former governor of Ingushetia. He's an extremely important player, and of course, Kadyrov is an important player. I think what we can see now is Putin knows who he can trust, and of course, Kadyrov has been a very loyal servant for many years now, and he's accumulated enormous amounts of power. And I think he can provide a kind of stability that Prigozhin couldn't.
Do you think we will see Redut grow in influence over the coming months?
No, because it's not a brand. It will never achieve the kind of juggernaut like social power that Wagner had. If it does, then we know that something is wrong, and the lights are blinking red, and that something is trouble is brewing for Mr. Putin.
And are there other groups similar to Redut that we should be aware of operating on behalf of Russia at the moment?
Well, we assume that RSB Group continues to operate. We don't hear very much about them. They are primarily, I think, kind of viewed as a more kind of standard, almost vanilla, and genuine private military contractor on some level. I still think that they manage to be more obedient, right, to the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Emergency Services. But a lot of their missions have mostly consisted of demining, some defensive operations around particular energy installations, but they are more disciplined and they are quieter, and their tether is closer to the Ministry of Emergency Services than it is to the Ministry of Defense in terms of just kind of their kind of political patronage.
Just finally, Candace, I wonder how you reflect on how Putin has reacted to the Wagner mutiny and the death of Prigozhin. Do you think he has come out, if not stronger, then certainly restored some of his strength in recent months? Or do you think maybe it has weakened him in the long term?
Well, I think when you have to kill your own citizens in broad daylight, in public, it does not suggest strength. What it suggests is you have a difficult time managing the rule of law in your country. And when you have a difficult time managing the rule of law in your country, it can come back to bite you. And I think that's what we saw with the mutiny. I think that those conditions haven't changed very much. And in fact, in some ways, now the question is for the forces who were arrayed against Yevgeny Prigozhin, okay, which were not just, of course, Putin's people, but others who came for him from Ukraine, from elsewhere. Do they have an appetite now to take on other ultranationalists? And how big is the ultranationalist kind of engine now, given that Putin has clipped its wings by putting away Igor Strelkov, who, of course, is a longtime provider of similar services for the FSB? Uh, is he stronger today? No, I would say no. I think I still hold that Putin has been greatly weakened by the situation with the Wagner Group. He's had to reorganize, and he's also had to retrench on public positions that he took for many years of having no involvement whatsoever with this plausibly deniable force. Now he has to own it, and now all of the lines of communication between the Kremlin and these networked paramilitaries are exposed to public scrutiny. And he, I think, ultimately recognizes that, and that's why we see kind of the mask being dropped.
And that's a really interesting key point you just made there about what used to be speculated about the plausible deniability of groups like the Wagner Group, and that was some of the attraction of them. Are you saying now that is all gone, and Putin has no plausible deniability about the activities of groups like Redut?
I think that's right, and I think that's one reason why he embraced the idea with a wink and a nod of pushing Yevgeny Prigozhin out. You know, there was no coming back from somebody getting on camera and screaming and shouting for the head of the Minister of Defense and the head of the general staff for the military. There was no coming back from that. There was no coming back from saying on national television, as Putin did only weeks after the mutiny, that yes, the government had paid for the Wagner Group, that yes, mistakes had been made, and they had been costly mistakes, even if they were only Prigozhin's mistakes. Nonetheless, Putin owned it, and now he's eating it, and it's very difficult for him to maneuver now that all of these lines of connections are exposed.
Candace, Rondeaux, thank you so much for your time today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.